So what I suggest is we start maybe with the space of debating the current situation, questions of clarity, the current ethics, and we'll try and move, as we've got about 50 minutes plus, to what should we do about it, sort of how we can move forward, and maybe where transparency goes, what the sort of, how can you get the whole world to sort of cooperate. But would anyone like to start with some questions now? We've got, now, who we got? Anne, I think we've got, people are very keen. We'll start with Anne at the back.
I was challenged Richard because, devil's advocate here, because the fact is that we democratically decided to deregulate our financial system, to deregulate our economy, major elements of our economy. We all like globalization, we all like being able to go take our holidays abroad and take our money abroad and so on and so forth. And we've never objected to politicians changing the tax law so that people can move their money around easily. So my question to you is, the point about democracy is that these decisions aren't made by accountants, they're made by politicians, elected politicians.
So we're the fault, and democracy is the fault in getting us into the place we're at. I'll just take one or two. Well,
I would like to compound on what this lady has said as well.
Right.
Because my position, the free market mantra is not where I stand, but I have to comment on this. The West, this country, America, the Prime Minister comes all the time and talk about, the merits of free market, etc. You've presented in a very good way the tax haven position, the assault on democracy and on social justice, etc. And you made a case and pull from ethics, etc. I come from Mauritius Island, which is a tax haven. Yeah? And I'm a socialist, I'm left-wing. I believe in paying the tax, more the Keynesian run this so-called free market. But you guys have got to make up your mind, because you can't, and I'm talking holistically, I can't, philosophically, you can't on one hand pitch about the merits of capitalism, and then it comes with a lot of contradictions, and then from there on, keep moving the goalpost constantly. Countries like globalization, and I'm an older globalist, if not an anti-globalist, because globalization has been pushed by the West down the throat of everybody else in the rest of the world. And a lot of those countries feel assaulted. Countries like Mauritius, globalization has not done, if one thing I know when I go back there is inequality has increased, and some of the whole industry has been totally shattered. These countries got to eat, they got to fight. So the tax haven is nothing but international fiscal competition. And the West cannot compete. I have to, sorry for the expression, bitch and moan, and now try to invent new laws, CRS reporting, etc. These people have got to eat as well. Now, I understand what you're saying. My point is, I'm on the side of taxation. My point is, you've got to make up your mind about globalization, free market. You can't go along with it when it pays the bills and you have interest to be reaped. And then suddenly when it works against your interest, then you start politically demonize those countries. That's the point I was trying to make.
Okay. So, in a way, let's take those and take a response to that, because I think the general is that actually the real fault lies almost with us and the politicians we've elected to unleash globalization and the free market and the flexibilities that allowed everyone not to pay any tax.
And the international institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and all those who
all have pushed it. So the challenge was first to Richard. So we'll by Anne. So
I'm in again, am I?
You can go in. I will switch around, but your name was answered first, and the political sort of damage. Whose fault is it?
Whose fault is it? Well, actually, Judith, you named one of the people whose fault it was, and I'm very sure I know who you're talking about, but I won't name the gentleman in question. Economists have a great deal to answer for on this one. I've accidentally ended up as an academic economist in my career. It was an accident. I started as a chartered accountant. I'm still the only chartered accountant who's a professor of economics. It's quite a strange paradox, really, because the two normally don't have anything to do with each other, as most of you are probably aware. And actually that is a valuable insight, because economics at a macro level doesn't have tax in it. In fact, there isn't even money in macroeconomics, because in fact macroeconomics is a barter world. Now, it gets tacked on the edge, but actually, if you look at DGSE, Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium Economics, that is a world of barter where there is no money and there is no tax. And now that's completely farcical, of course. That is not the way we live. And so we do end up with tacked-on theories about these various things. But the point is that for a very long time, the whole theory of markets, the whole theory of capitalism, did not actually recognise that there was taxation as anything other than an assault on the right of free markets and an interference in the way in which they worked, an imperfection which had to be remedied by reducing the tax rate. That was what we were told, and that was the fundamental approach of most economists, which is why they would say, for example, corporation tax is an aberration which is charged on the wrong person to the wrong effect and therefore should never happen, even though in practice 154 countries, the last time I checked in the world, have got a corporation tax. That's almost all the ones of any size. About 98% of world GDP has a corporation tax. So we have this absolute paradox between what we were told and what is. And for a long time we were told, for example, that deregulation would result in more efficient markets. But we didn't actually think about the consequence of how did that deregulated market provide the environment in which it could fairly trade. So we didn't think about how was this payment to create the macroeconomic environment in which stability and monetary stability and so on was going to be provided, was ever going to be created. It was just assumed it would happen. And I literally say assumed, because economists, when they wish to solve a problem, assume that we have solved it. And thereafter it is solved by and large. I mean, that's where we start from in most economic modelling. Assume perfect competition, assume perfect knowledge, assume. Now, let's start the other way around. The other way around is actually your problem. How are people going to eat? And it's actually a fundamental problem. And I think there is a real problem from there. Now, if we look at the old prescriptions of people like the IMF and the World Bank, the Washington Consensus, they were heavily in favour of deregulation. They were heavily in favour of globalisation. They were heavily in favour of removing many of the most effective taxes which developing countries had. By far the most effective tax that most developing countries had was a tariff. It was the tax on goods leaving their country. Why was it effective? Because most countries were being depleted of their natural resources and they could charge a tax on it leaving, and the effect has been to try and reduce those tariffs, to reduce their tax revenues, to undermine their economic stability, to make them more dependent upon Western countries who could come in, now Chinese countries who can come, companies who can come in, and to make them more dependent on aid, to be totally honest. In fact, one of the things that we first, John Christensen and I were pretty much responsible for thinking up the tax justice agenda from 2003 onwards. We were both Oxfam volunteers, not always a trendy idea at this moment, but we were both Oxfam volunteers. And one of our motivations was to actually say, how do we move countries who are aid dependent on from being aid dependent to actually having resources? And the answer was to make sure that profit was recorded in the right place at the right time, so tax could be charged on it at the right rate, to provide the contribution that was necessary in many developing countries where they were being denied the right to charge a tariff, to therefore provide the resources that would ensure that a local economy could function properly. That was the motivation behind country-by-country reporting, which is the idea that a multinational company should report where it operates, how much it makes, how many people it employs, how much profit it makes, and how much tax it pays in every country, so we can work out whether they are shifting profits or not. I've heard gentle whispers from people close to your successor, Judith, who say it's a very useful thing. Very gentle whispers that this might be true, because it means that companies are now realising they can't get away with depleting Mauritius of resources. And actually, it's going to give rise to questions about why profits are recorded in Mauritius, and of course that is a big problem, because Indian profits tend to arrive in Mauritius, we know that. But in future, we'd also be seeing profits shifting back into Mauritius, I hope. Now that is the answer, that we have to root capitalism in the societies in which it exists, within the economies within which it exists, within the tax frameworks within which they exist. And only when we put those things back together and realise that we live in an integrated world, not some theory on a blackboard, can we solve that problem of how do we get money to where it is rightfully earned, which is indeed Mauritius, amongst others. And I believe we can do that. And that is the whole motive for actually getting international corporations to be honest about where their money comes from. And I believe that is the answer to your question.
Right now, Judith, how,
Yeah.
is it all down? Have we been duped by economists? Are economists the,
Well, I
the
cer-
baddies?
I certainly remember. I remember a paper many years ago that we unfortunately one of our economists got into a room with a special advisor and was asked to write a paper and did a pure economics paper, and it began, imagine a world with no tax and no debt, and it was just okay, that's certainly not the real one. I mean, there is a place for economics, but I think it needs to be tempered by political realities. I mentioned, I think on Anne's point about democracy and our politicians, I think there are a number of things going on there. I think one of them is that there is just a woeful lack of scrutiny of tax measures, and it kind of comes back to the point I was making, just a lack of education and awareness about tax. So, tax is something technical, and I'm not sure that there is enough debate about tax measures, real debate about tax measures in Parliament. And there's also something that's happened over the last 10 more years, actually. I think it goes back before. It goes back certainly to the Brown and Blair governments, that for many, many years the government has raised taxes by anti-avoidance measures. So if you look in budget after budget after budget after budget, going back 10, 15 years, billions each year is scored in the budget scorecard for anti-avoidance measures. And that, those measures, many of those measures are good measures, but the idea that you can constantly raise all of that money through anti-avoidance measures, I think, is potentially under some doubt. And the Office of Budgetary Regulation, the OBR, published a report in the autumn which actually said, look, you can't carry on scoring all of these anti-avoidance measures, but which are very uncertain, inherently very uncertain, and spending it on very certain expenditures. So you're raising all this money supposedly every year, and I think they calculated that for the next several years, 10 billion a year is supposedly coming from all these anti-avoidance measures. But it may or may not be actually raised, but it's definitely going out the door on spending measures. So you've got a very uncertain thing on one hand and not on the other.
Presumably that's because they're trying to hide
Well,
any talk.
well, indeed, and I think one of the problems is that the reality is, as a society, we probably need to raise some taxes. And you saw what happened when there was an idea of a national insurance being raised a year ago, and it didn't happen. But I think as a society, if we are to maintain our public services, I think you can argue where it should come from and maintain a progressive system. But I think as a society, we will need to raise our taxes, and I don't think that debate has been had, because we've had this apparent money coming in year after year from anti-avoidance measures. Just one quick thing on globalisation. My view is that globalisation is now a reality, and from a tax perspective we have to deal with it. We have to look at issues globally, because multinationals will exploit the international tax framework, they'll exploit the gaps between national taxes, and we have to look at that through international institutions like the OECD. I think the EU is now very much getting its act together on tax. For many years it was quite difficult actually to do anti-avoidance measures because of certain EU constraints, but actually I think they're getting their act together quite well on tax. Appreciate that some of the countries we think of as tax havens have very real economies, and we need to be really careful. And I would say that a lot of the countries that we need to be most concerned about are not ones that you would normally think of as tax havens. There are some members of the European Union who sort of shade into that sort of tax haven territory and behaviour, and the US. A lot of multinational tax planning has been driven by the quirks in the US tax system. They've now had this change. I won't call it reform, because I don't think the word can really apply to the chaotic way in which it happened. But those US tax changes have changed the landscape in a way that I don't think anybody understands, and I don't think anybody's going to understand it properly for many years to come. And I think that is a real risk to many other countries, then I think there's a real need for multilateral work to look at how that change in the US tax system is going to affect global tax planning and global tax revenues. So I think it's not, the tax haven, we should, very often when at OECD, when they come up with a list, or the EU, they come up with a list of tax havens, they pick the easy guys. You're not going to say the United States is a tax haven, but I think the way that some of those bigger countries operate is worse actually than some of the smaller ones.
The Netherlands.
Paul?
Yes.
Yeah. Like you mentioned Hong Kong. I've always been impressed by the fact that the government of Hong Kong couldn't sell the land because they leased it from the Chinese. And therefore, they charged everyone rent on all the land they used and ran the government largely on the rent they get from the land. And that's my first question. Should we be moving in a similar direction here? My second question is an ethical question. I think that taxes are currently disproportionately levied off the bottom half of the population. And democracy is a disastrous failure, and it has failed to be proportionate to the way it levies taxes. And a particular example I would want to mention is the fact that since 2013, local authorities, about 289 out of 326 local authorities have been actually taxing benefits. So the central government pays a benefit and all of the people may survive. And they are not survivable on at £73.10 adult unemployment a week after rent and council tax. You then tax that and you're pushing people not only food banks but onto the streets. So I think that is a major ethical issue. We have been disproportionately taxing the poorest for a long time, and probably not only just the poorest, but probably also and the other thing, going just back quickly to Hong Kong, if you tax land, we know where they live, and so their land may even call back some of the stuff that's been put into the Cayman Islands. So those two issues, disproportionately taxing the poor, and should we be moving in the direction of a land value tax or land value recovery or rent or whatever you like to call it, but getting some money out of people's land, which doesn't interfere with the market. It interferes with the market least if you take the rents off land.
Okay, so we've got a land tax as a possible solution. I know are you going to talk about land tax as well? Or?
I wasn't.
No, okay. Are you sure? and how to get away or removing the burden on the poor. What would you like to add? Is there anything in that sort of space?
I was just a bit worried about the emphasis on ethics. Yeah, I think relying on the ethics of PricewaterhouseCoopers is where everything's gone wrong. But why can't you tighten up the legislation to bring
you need the law as well.
To bring the legislation part up to the ethics part?
Okay. Well, let's take those two, because actually there's sort of three questions there, and I'm quite interested to get into the last one of the ethics of the big four, because they do claim to be ethical, don't they? And in terms of we blame the economists, so are the big four just we're just following the economic rules? We're just following the law, trying to make people as tax efficient as possible. What's wrong with that?
Can I come out on the land tax?
Yeah, take the land tax.
I think the land tax is an interesting one, and it came up interestingly. I was at an event a few weeks ago in Parliament, and one of the MPs mentioned precisely this land tax, and couldn't we potentially have more land tax? I have a lot of sympathy for that view if we're talking about individuals. I think that using land as a way of taxing individuals, I think land is probably undertaxed overall in the UK on individuals. Where I have a much bigger problem with it is as a business tax, and a lot of land is owned by business. And I think the problem you get into there is if you increase the tax on land, as compared with other things, you would increase a distortion that's already there. So currently we have a major distortion between, say, physical retailers in the high street and companies who shall remain nameless, who trade digitally and don't need to have shops on the high street.
You must reduce other taxes at the same time.
Yes, but I think I would just be concerned that if we increase, in terms of businesses as opposed to individuals, if we increase that distortion, potentially that could just exacerbate a problem that already exists. So I think it's an interesting area for individuals.
Abolish business rate.
Possibly, yeah.
I know lots of small companies that love the landlord to be paying for them.
Well, the landlord, yes, maybe
and
the landlord,
then not
yeah.
to be paying the business rate.
Rates. Yeah. So I think that's that could be one idea. In terms of the ethics of the tax professions and the Big Four, I think this may sound odd, but I think they're better than they used to be.
They are.
So that if I remember, so I was in the Revenue HMRC for 27 years, and if I remember back, some of the things that people got up to were even worse. The other thing that I would say in terms of the current position is that if you look at what some other, perhaps smaller outfits, advisors are getting up to, sort of boutique advisors, they are also a lot worse, I think, than the Big Four. So I happened to see something recently which I found quite shocking, which was a small advisor basically just saying, well, just hope HMRC doesn't see something, and that actually isn't about ethics. That is actually going over a bar, and if an advisor is telling you that you should just cross your fingers HMRC doesn't see this, that is evasion. That is crossing a line. So again, Big Four wouldn't get into that, but I think there is a lot more that the Big Four could do, but I think they have come quite a long way, and it's interesting. I was at an event about 3 years ago, which was I think it was the Chartered Institute of Taxation. We had an annual lecture, and there was somebody giving that lecture that year. I can't remember who he was, but it was very striking because he basically stood up and said the profession has to basically get its act together, wake up call. It was quite direct. He basically said we have to, if we're going to regard ourselves as a profession, we have to basically accept, it's kind of what I was saying, accept that public opinion has moved, and the sort of things that we have been advising clients on is not acceptable, and we should just wake up and we shouldn't carry on with this. Quite a strong view. Certainly that was when I was in HMRC, and I was quite struck by the strength of his view, and also struck by the fact that I think one person got up and disagreed with it. Some people didn't quite agree with everything, and were sort of accepting the basic principle, but some quibbles around the edges. But only one person actually dared to stand up in that room and argue against that, which I thought was interesting. That actually, maybe the tax professions themselves recognise it as an issue, that they have to be aware that some of what they've been advising clients on is just not something that the public would find acceptable.
But what about, just to add that, because I think it's an interesting question. I mean, the professions are seen as a sort of bedrock of the middle class, of respectability, of ethics. Shouldn't they be, they say, oh, they don't accept it. What about them? Do they not have any ethics anymore? They have to wait to people sort of external to say, oh, we don't accept this. I mean, isn't it them who should be considering their own ethics?
But I think then you get back in, it's partly about what I was saying about the tax bubble. That I think there is, for many years, the conversations between people in the tax world and at a very technical level, and people didn't actually stand back and look at some of what was going on in tax from the perspective of people who knew nothing about tax. And I think what can happen is if you have if you have an ongoing, over many, many years, you've had a very polite conversation going on within a particular community, and it's when the lights shone up from the outside and said, look what's going on, just stand back, is this really acceptable? And I think that's started to happen, but we've not got to the end of that process.
And what about the poverty, the poor taking a disproportionate hit on tax?
Certainly, I mean, I don't know the detail of the council tax, but that does sound, I mean, almost, it takes me back to sort of poll tax.
Yes, I do.
Sort of...
and the enforcement of it on tax there.
Yeah.
Cost of notifying.
Richard?
Well, I suppose I should declare I'm a chartered accountant, and I did train with KPMG, so there we go. It was a long time ago I left them.
I did Arthur Anderson.
Much
worse, even.
Yeah, that's worse. Look, I'll start there, but I'm going to come back to you, Paul, don't worry. I do debate with my own institute quite often the issue of whether they should be taking leadership, and I think they're far too timid. They're far too timid about what accountants can do, and lawyers, let's be clear. There's a lovely paper I'd recommend to you by a tax barrister who's now actually doing a PhD in tax. But his name is David Quentin, and it's called Risk Mining the Exchequer, if I remember correctly. It's quite technical in a sense, but what he says is that accountants and lawyers do an amazingly useful job when they start working for a client, because their first job is to make sure that the client is within the law. And most of them haven't got a clue whether they are. And my experience of that is absolutely right. The client comes through the door and thinks they can do something, you have to say, no you can't. Mm-hmm. You really do need to change it to do it like this, and then actually that will be legal. Like, you claim that person is self-employed, and no, they're an employee. If you really think they're self-employed, then you're going to have to fundamentally change the real nature of the contract between the two of you to look like this. Not just the wording, the real nature of the contract to do this, and so on. Or if you want to claim that you're exporting, then you better have some goods crossing a border. Or whatever is necessary to... Now, so that is the first fundamental job. And actually, accountants who do that reduce risk for both their client and for the tax authority. That's a socially valuable thing. It increases the rate of compliance, it reduces the rate of inquiry, it reduces the rate of error. I think that's a really socially valuable thing, and I don't think it could happen without the tax profession. So I'm going to defend the role of the tax profession in that sense. The trouble is that some of them don't know when to stop. Because there is a point when you move beyond moving the client from uncertainty towards as close as you can get to certainty, and all words have uncertain meaning. You've only got to say I love you and work out the interpretations of that to realise that tax law is about as vague on occasions. But then they move beyond the point of trying to reach some degree of certainty towards, well, if we take a bit of risk here or there, the law's unclear, we can perhaps try that, we don't know what the probability of success is. Well, at one time, we know that accounting firms were willing to put their clients into positions where there was a 25% chance that they were right. So there was a 75% chance they were wrong. They would get a tax barrister to write an opinion, and this was a well-known game, and the tax barrister would say, there's a chance it's right, and that was the defence. I took advice and I was told it could be right. Now, the latest version of the Big Four firms' ethics is, on balance of probabilities, it must be right. So in other words, they now go 50-50, or maybe 51-49. But we haven't got anything like to a position where it is on balance of probabilities very likely to be right. And I think that's where we've got to get to. They simply have not gone far enough yet. And that is because there are undoubtedly members of the profession who do not think that, who believe their job is to minimise tax come hell or high water. Tax is theft. I mean, I've heard this said by many senior lawyers in particular, all tax is theft. And my job is to prevent theft, they say. And whilst that attitude persists in some of the profession, we are going to have this risk. So we should have a stronger general anti-avoidance principle in the UK. We ended up with a general anti-abuse rule. I was actually on the committee that George Osborne put together to actually write some of the rules for that. Was considered to be rather outside my remit by some who were in the tax justice movement for working for George Osborne on this committee. They thought I was sold out to the devil. I thought I was doing useful work, and I still do think it was. But I also wrote the Labour Party amendment. It was a very funny day, actually, when the General Anti-Abuse Rule was discussed in Parliament, where the Minister, David Gauke, was standing up defending it, and the opposition motion was also written by me. I sat in the gallery and watched the Minister and the Shadow Minister debating it, both of them looking up and laughing at me, and as David Gauke said afterwards, for once you couldn't reply. It was very amusing. But we do need to have better law, because remember, it is now true that tax avoidance is not necessarily legal in the UK. You can actually undertake tax avoidance which is ruled to be unacceptable, ineffective, does not work, and there can even be a penalty applied now because of the General Anti-Abuse Rule. It needs to go further. If your intention is to subvert the rule of law in the action that you're undertaking, and obviously intention is something which is a little difficult to prove, but not impossible in the days of email, as Donald Trump is beginning to find out, back to Mueller again, let alone his son-in-law finding out. So intention is capable of better demonstration than perhaps was the case in the past. Land value tax. So I think we have a long way to go with the Big Four. I think they have to understand intention is key, and when they understand that, I think we'll be there. The accountancy profession, I gave a briefing to some people who are meeting this morning. They've simply got to move their position to balance of probabilities right, not balance of probabilities will get away with it. That's where we need to move to. Land value tax, I'm a fan of, so long as it is one of many taxes. I have real problems with the people who say land value tax can replace everything. That is a bit like going to play a round of golf with a sand wedge as the only thing in your bag. Now, I'm not a golfer. I played 6 rounds in my life, which was plenty enough to realise I was really doing the wrong thing. I don't know why it took 6 rounds to get that far, but anyway, a sand wedge by itself is not going to let you play a round of golf. It's incredibly useful when you're in a bunker. Well, LVT is very useful for certain types of situation, and I think it can be a much more effective local tax, for example, than we've got now. But it is not the basis of all tax. It works particularly well in Hong Kong, yes, because the land is owned by basically on lease by the government. True in Singapore as well, by the way, which lots of people hold up as this model of free enterprise, and then they don't realise that actually 83% of people in Singapore live in council-owned or government-owned accommodation. There is very little private housing. The vast majority of the government's income in Singapore is in fact rent on the housing which the government owns. Oh, and the 10 largest quoted companies on the Singapore Stock Exchange are all owned majority by the government. This is this model of free enterprise. It's all nationalised. It's really quite bizarre how we actually end up with this supposed parent. It might as well be Marxist. The entire rent, the profit on the top of the economy is already scraped off by the government already, either as land rents or actually all the profits belong to them anyway. They don't have to tax them, they're theirs anyway. So it's a very weird, sort of almost crypto Soviet-style system in Singapore, which we hold up as a model for free enterprise. No, it isn't. But LVT is useful. It is better than council tax by a long way. Council tax is a deeply regressive tax because it's capped at a point which is quite ridiculous. We haven't had a revaluation since 1992, and obviously that's distorted. I mean, I live in a house built in 2005, which has a 1992 valuation. Which is obviously quite bizarre. If you tax on the basis of fairy tales, you end up with nonsense. I mean, that is what I've said about international tax for large corporations as well, where it is believed that every single subsidiary of a multinational company is completely independent of all other subsidiaries of that company. Well, again, that's another fairy tale, which does not obviously hold true, and therefore you end up with nonsense taxation. So we have to obviously move to a fair basis, and that LVT is part of it. There should be no tax on those on lowest income. We actually are in a situation, I mean, you're absolutely right, Paul. If you look at the profile of who pays the highest overall rate of tax in the UK, it is the people in the lowest 10% of income earners in the country. Their overall tax rate is more than 40% of their gross income, although their gross income is incredibly small. It is, of course, not income tax, because every time we talk about tax, we think about income tax, which is why the Telegraph keeps on saying, 25% of all tax is paid by the top 1% of income earners. Yeah, well, it may be income taxes, but that's because they earn a stonking fortune in terms of, in relation to everybody else. No, surprising, they actually pay less as a total proportion of their income for those in the bottom 10% who pay lots of tobacco taxes, lots of alcohol taxes, lots of standing rates. They obviously do pay council taxes. They also have to have a television licence, which is a tax by any other name, because you basically can't get around it, and it's a poll tax by any other name. It doesn't matter how high your income is, you pay the same amount. That's a poll tax. These things are deeply unjust, and we need to reform that so we get around those problems. Is that possible? Yes, it is. We can actually change this. We could also reform national insurance, which is regressive and comes in at a much lower rate now than income tax. You know, income tax doesn't come into 11,500 now, but national insurance kicks in at 8,500. Why? Because politically nobody notices national insurance, so we leave this very high rate of tax on those who are actually earning not a lot of money. So there's massive ranges of reforms that could happen there. Do remember, at the other end of the scale, of course, we have this problem with land. It is untaxed. The first thing we must do is actually tax people's homes. Why are houses so flipping expensive? Because we have, throughout my lifetime, as far as I'm aware, never taxed a person's home. When should we tax it? When they die. Do you know, you have no use for a house when you're dead. It's a matter of fact. Now, of course, you should be allowed to let it go to your next of kin. And if you had a long-term carer looking after you, yes, I can see sensible provision for them being allowed to stay in the house for life and so on. But at some point, that house has to move out of the possession of the previous main occupier. And at that point, a tax charge should arise. What should that tax charge be? Capital gains tax. Because that's what you will have enjoyed on it. What should the rate be? Oh, income tax rates. Why should we charge capital gains at a lower rate than income tax? It only provides an incentive for everybody to try to change things from being income into capital gains. It is a standard accountant's trick. Almost as good as the biggest research and development industry in the whole of the UK now, which is in fact how to actually research and develop methods of claiming research and development tax amounts. So this is actually what accountants do. They come up with artificial schemes to actually try to get around a tax. If we try to create a level playing field between taxes, and God bless him, Nigel Lawson actually managed to have the same rate of capital gains tax and income tax. You know, amazing. I have to bless Nigel Lawson for this one because nobody's done it since. But he did. And that stops the avoidance. But we must actually do this. Inheritance tax are nonsense. Let's get rid of it. Let's charge capital gains tax during life. Let's charge capital gains tax on death. Let's do it at income tax rates. That's quite fair. Let's move out of this absurd situation, again, where families spend forever worrying about death taxation. No, it's not death taxation. It's about actually making it possible for the next generation to buy a house. And I took part in a debate on the Jeremy Vine show once on Radio 2. It's always an edifying experience to sit with Jeremy Vine. He hates taxation, which I find very funny. But there he was saying, oh, it's terrible that people have to sell their houses at a certain age and the next generation can't inherit. And I said, Jeremy, my dad's still alive. I'm 59. If I'd waited for Dad to die before a family, when do you think I might have got on with the job? For heaven's sake, don't be stupid. We don't wait for the family castle to move on unless we're the Duke of Northumberland or somewhere. Well, in that case, yeah, we've even got provisions to let that happen if we pass it for the benefit of the state. No, this is nonsense, has to move on. We have to be realistic. Land has got to be taxed in the future, and wealth has to be, because wealth inequality is a massive obstacle to opportunity in this country and around the world. And thankfully, the IMF and World Bank are now saying it. I have written a chapter in a book on wealth taxation for the World Bank. The mere fact I was asked to write a chapter on wealth taxation for the World Bank was, I thought, quite a sort of significant event. They've recognised we might need to do it.
Brilliant.
Given that we still don't have a third runway at Heathrow, our ability to enact anything that appears vaguely logical is strictly limited in my book. Some of the principles behind taxation I studied at A-level 40 plus years ago. We're still having the same debates. What are the drivers for proper, good tax reform? Is it, one, we're running out of money as a government? Two, the OECD has finally got traction in its activities. Three, the public is pissed off with reading the same old stuff that we've been reading for years in the press, despite what the Daily Tory Graph might say. Or what else is it? And where is the wisdom that's going to drive this?
How do politicians actually get to do it? There's,
You were talking about wealth and taxing wealth. So I was wondering if you agree with the analysis of Thomas Piketty, which had quite a vogue 2 or 3 years ago.
and well, we can be reminded what that was. And I've got 3 things, but I've just had 2 men, so I'll go Valerie.
I've been struck by how often tonight you've said that public opinion has galvanised a lot of energy around this, and I'm thinking that public opinion hasn't been swayed as much, perhaps, by the tax issue per se, as by other things that are affecting them, like 0-hours contracts and lousy services because of austerity and so on. So I'm just wondering, I know this is a meeting about tax, but I wondered if you could set the agenda for government action, where would you put tax? Would you do something like employment law first, or where does this sit in a range of other government policies?
Okay, well that's good. So this fundamental question is, how do we actually create the political momentum for change in the tax system? Because governments have been terrified of it for ages, haven't they? Unable to touch it. And also with Piketty and the inequality. Judith?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of government, and it kind of comes to your point as well, I think I can't see over the next few years till perhaps the next general election, government is just completely preoccupied with Brexit. I don't think there's any bandwidth for the government really to do very much on tax at all, and certainly nothing very controversial. And it kind of comes back to the point I was making earlier. I think there are some controversial things that need to be done on tax. I don't think you can get by just year on year raising something for the scorecard and spending it. I think you have to actually have some fundamental tax reform. I think the taxation of the way people work needs to be looked. I think that does interact with some of the employment law issues. And Taylor Review last year wasn't meant to look at tax, but it did flag up some of the tax which was exacerbating some of the problems, so that there's a very strong incentive on employers to employ people as self-employed. And the tax is working with all the other pressures to actually mean that people are not getting the rights protection that they should have, as well as the rights tax as well. So I think that ought to be a really top priority, but I cannot see that happening in the next.
Can I just challenge you by saying, let's imagine Brexit didn't exist.
Oh.
How about that? Hey,
You're an economist.
let's just assume Brexit doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So now, what could be, do you think, the sort of narrative or the story? How could a government actually get out there and tell a story that was powerful enough to actually do tax reform?
I think one of the things that may enable some hard decisions to be made on tax is potentially linking it with, say, funding the NHS. So there's there's been a very strong resistance to anything that looks like hypothecation of tax for a particular purpose in the UK, and that's been, the Treasury has kept to that very strongly. But I think given that there seems to be a groundswell of opinion that the NHS is desperately short of money, I think one way that you could actually have some significant tax reform, and people might be prepared to pay more tax, is if they could see that it was going to fund the NHS, and I think that potentially could galvanise it. So I think that might be.
It's interesting, there's another example of the power of economists, because the non-hypothecation is a theory of efficient allocation that they've managed to keep absolutely to, even though politically it makes no sense.
I think,
and they don't get so much tax.
And I think politically, again, it's kind of tax coming out of the tax bubble. It is political, and I think linking it to some of those things might be the way to go. And
the link to inequality, do you think that could be galvanised a sort of tax?
Well, potentially, you could. The government won't, but you could see a narrative around, yes, the NHS, but also Brexit was a protest vote. There are people in desperate poverty around the UK. So, you know, potentially you could galvanise political will around that, but I can't see that happening on, you know, in anything like the current political reality.
It's interesting that the undercurrents of Brexit don't seem to be addressed at all.
No,
while
they
we
don't.
struggle with the...
No, they just the sort of surface. We've got to do it, and then all
Yeah.
the bandwidth of government is taken up by that, and actually addressing some of the things that led to that vote are not being addressed at all.
Richard, what's that?
Anne is desperate to say something.
I'm not desperate. I wanted to give you an example of South Africa, actually, because, as you know, I was born in South Africa. Go back there quite a lot. South Africa had a big problem in that Africans had not paid taxes. They'd also not benefited from any public services. So they saw no link between paying taxes and public services. And what's been remarkable is that the Inland Revenue Department of the South African government then went on a propaganda campaign and explained to Africans that if they wanted clean water, sanitation, education and so on, they would pay taxes. And it was a proper campaign. The problem is that I don't believe HMRC has the resources to run a campaign to explain to the public, you know, what tax revenues do. But it was really interesting to watch the South Africa. You know, throughout Africa there's huge problems with people not paying taxes, with the governments not having a proper tax base to underpin their currency and so on. The South Africans have changed that, and they changed that largely through, you know, propaganda. But it would
Communication.
Well,
do that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think just in terms of that, the point about South Africa, I think it does show just the link between taxation and democratic institutions, and how that can be a very, very positive link.
Yeah.
There is, I recall that in the last few years, government's introduced something whereby people get some kind of breakdown of how their tax is spent, but that was very much done as a government sort of spin thing. Yeah, so I'm not sure that there's the same. I think similar things have happened in Australia actually, but I think that but HMRC is so much under pressure in all sorts of ways,
Sure.
and Brexit's not going to help that.
Richard, you go.
Have we changed tax since 1776 is one of the big questions. Because that's when Adam Smith wrote, of course, The Wealth of Nations. I happened to start at university in 1976, 200 years later, and so dutifully read The Wealth of Nations. And I'm still told that the 4 principles of tax that Adam Smith wrote in 1776 are the basis on which we should charge tax now. What a load of nonsense. You know, the world has moved on a little bit. Adam Smith didn't know about corporation tax because there fundamentally weren't any corporations as such at the time. He didn't know about a large number of things that we now know about, and his principles really don't stand. We do have to move on. It's fundamental. We do need to actually root and branch, stand back. And I was having this discussion with the Tax Justice Campaign this afternoon, saying that we actually need to talk about why tax is a good thing. I mean, that is why I wrote the book, The Joy of Tax, but you know, I'm pretty pleased with that. It sold 10,000 copies, available from any bookshop, including some bad ones. Yes, it's on Amazon, in other words. And I've been criticised heavily for the fact it is. I can't control what my publisher does. And anyway, that's up to them. So, look, we need to actually stand back and say, what is tax for? And I would actually say hypothecated taxes are the absolute antithesis of everything that tax is for. I absolutely hate the idea of hypothecated taxes and everything that goes with them, because taxes do not pay for public services. Money printing pays for public services. Tax does not pay 1 penny of what we spend on a public service in this country, because the government can print as much money as it likes. It printed 435 billion of quantitative easing, which covered all the government borrowing from 2009 to 2012 inclusive, when we were being told that we needed austerity, and it was all written off. And as John Redwood, I will repeat it, said today, that's no longer government debt. It's finished, it's gone, it's just money. So we don't need to think in that way, but that means we've got to fundamentally re-educate what tax is about. It also means that we will not persuade people to pay more tax until we spend more. In other words, when people have seen the benefit of the spending, they will be willing to pay more tax. First of all, because they'll say, hey, the promise is already fulfilled, now I can pay for it, because by and large, most of us are a bit suspicious about paying in advance for what we get. Most of us like to see it, and then we pay for it. That's the way the world is. Well, that's what the government's got to do, but that means we've got to break this stupid argument that deficits are a bad thing. Deficits create money. That's all they create. Government deficits are new money to keep the economy going. If we spend more, we increase GDP, because government spending is one part of our national income. So we will increase the national income by the government spending more, presuming there are available resources in the economy to buy, that is, unemployed and underemployed people. There are now more than 5 million people who are self-employed in the UK, most of them entirely involuntary, because it's the way to get off benefits and be sanctioned as a result of being on benefits. That's why a large number of people have become self-employed. They would like a proper job, as they would see it. I'm not being patronising. They would like a regular paid employment, which is going to pay a lot more than the average earnings from self-employment, which are less than $10,000 a year now. So we have massive underemployment in this country. We could put that to use. We could spend the money. We could create new wealth. And if we create more wealth, then actually what happens is something very mysterious. People on higher incomes pay more tax. So if you spend and you increase the amount of activity in the economy, there are more people earning more and they pay more tax. And they spend what's left over with other people. And that increases the income of those people. And do you know what happens then? They pay more tax. And the people who receive that money spend some more. In fact, the government gets its money back. If it spends that money on investment, it can get up to double or more its money back. It's called the multiplier effect. It's been known about since Keynes introduced the idea in the 1930s. So we can spend to effectively invest to recover taxation. But we can't start by asking the question, where do we want to collect the tax? We start by asking the question, what do we want to spend on to create more prosperity in this country? When we've created more prosperity, there will be a bigger tax base to collect the money back from. So that's the case, but it's absolutely campaigning. Tax justice, the whole campaign about multinational companies started because John Christensen and I sat down and said we're going to put large companies on the front pages of national newspapers for using tax havens to exploit developing countries to underpay their tax there. And boy, did it work. I mean, that was literally a strategy. Well, the HMRC needs to do that as well, but HMRC needs to then be subject to absolutely fundamental top-down reform. I fundamentally agree with you about the people who work there, but I am deeply offended by the fact that the board of HMRC must only be drawn from big business. They are only business people who are on the board of HMRC, representing a very, very narrow interest in society. Why aren't there pensioners on the board of HMRC? Why aren't there employees? Why aren't there charities? Why aren't there small businesses? Why do you have to be an ex-Big Four accountant to basically be on the board of HMRC? Completely got to change the culture there for a start. We do have to do wealth taxation. Whoever referred to Piketty. Piketty, of course, introduced the idea of a worldwide wealth tax to try and tackle problems. At the time, it was laughed at. But since then, we have introduced automatic information exchange on the wealth held in tax havens. It was one of the campaigns we ran from Tax Justice. We said we want to know. And in June 2009, I sat in the Treasury in a meeting in the UK, was told, you will not get automatic information exchange on balances held by people in tax havens in your lifetime, Richard. Well, it's happening and I'm still alive. So we've got that. But that means we can now do a wealth tax because we can trace the money. We never could. Now we can. So we can begin to make those changes. But we have to talk about what's possible as a result. And that is a massive education programme, I agree with you. But is HMRC in its current format the people to run that? No, because frankly they're committed to the old school. And that's the big problem. They are an obstacle to political change. And so is the current government, because the current government actually wants to cut the size of government. We have not had austerity because we couldn't afford to provide the NHS or public services or pay benefits or that we needed a bedroom tax. We did it because there was a social policy behind that which was to penalise people and to increase disparity in society. That was a positive social goal of theirs. That's why it happened. So we have to change that whole basis. But we start by spending more money. Where would I start with the changes? NIC is the first tax that we need to look at. It was a wonderful tax in 1945. it suited a world where you left school at 15 and you joined an employer with the expectation you'd stay there for 50 years, take your pension. You would, of course, if you were male, do that. If you were female, of course, you would actually leave work when you got married and you would never work again, and there was this modular family, and there was no such thing as fluidity. There were a tiny number of self-employed people, almost no companies. It was all very rigid. Now we live in a world where there's incredible flexibility. You know, we can now manage gender fluidity, but damn it, we can't manage people who are both self-employed and employed at the same time. That's apparently impossible. I don't understand why that's the case. That if I'm employed some of the week, I am, and I'm self-employed the rest, I have 2 different codes, 2 different national insurance systems, 2 different arrangements, 2 different situations to put on my tax return, completely different methods of calculating my income. That is bizarre. We have to now design a tax system that suits the world we live in. And that most sure as heck isn't the one we've got now. We've got taxes, PAYE 1945, National Insurance 1945, Corporation Tax 1965, Capital Gains Tax 1965. What else have we got? Oh, Inheritance Tax was actually Capital Transfer Tax 1974. Have we had any significant tax change since 1974? No. Has the world changed since 1974? You know, the Bay City Rollers were number 1 in 1974, for those old enough to remember it, and I do, or Donny Osmond, probably. No, I mean, we're gone a little bit further. Status Quo were around too, I think. You know, it was pretty grim at that point, as far as music was concerned, when it wasn't great with regard to some tax, and we had inflation of 26%. It is a different world, but we haven't changed our tax system to suit. We've got to start afresh and think anew for what taxation does in this economy now. Is it possible? Yeah, look, 10,000 people read my blog every day because they're hungry. I'm astonished that 10,000 people do read my blog every day, but that's the average audience at the moment because they're hungry for thinking about the way we can change this system.
Now, we are at 8:30, though we did start slightly late, and that wasn't too bad an upbeat end. But I'm willing to go 2 or 3 minutes further if we have very quick questions, and then we can have a last sort of response to that and wrap up and get to the wine and not counterfeit crisp snacks. Now we'll start with you.
Yeah, I've just got a question. Isn't that the point that you said that there was a tax in '74? There hasn't been any really major significant taxes since then. Isn't that the fact that we as a people in the West have changed? We've become more greedy and more spoiled. And in that climate of greed and spoiledness, and the fact that we don't have any value for the environment, and we don't value what bees do, that has no economic or productive worth, has numerical value, doesn't exist on any P&L or balance sheet anywhere on the planet. You know, how are you going to get? How are you going to get any change?
So culture's up, but that sort of takes us back to themes of how can you change. But we could go that. Paul, where do you go?
Well, I think the reality is we don't want to pay tax, and I don't think that's changed by any of these grand words. And you have to just look through history, and you see that. And everybody in this room will probably want to not pay more tax than they have to pay. So why is it different for other people than you? So I'm not against I pay my tax, so I don't try to avoid it. But I thought on Richard's discussion about taxation as a tool for, not taxation, money printing and kind of circular flows within the economy to create value. I think whilst that's somewhat true, I think that's really dangerous as a concept for how we're going to push our economy forward. Things happen rather by accident. So the idea that we're going to take all this money and direct it and do stuff and continue to create value, because what counts is we create value of some sort. Now, how we measure that and what it is really hard to understand. But somehow we create value and we go forward. And never before have we really shown the ability to plan our future and make it happen and execute it. So that kind of argument in total doesn't work. And I think really, as an aside, in kind of talking about how that money can be directed and taxation in its role, it's kind of like the super financialization of the economy. It's like what you would criticize bankers for, in effect, or the financial economy. And I think some of the discussion on taxation has great parallels with what people would call the financialization of the economy. So taking money to give to the NHS is kind of necessary, but there's an element of financialization that we keep having to pay for more and more services, and we want more and more services, and we need more and more services. It comes within this kind of financial circular remit, and the thing is the value of the services provided are the good. And I think the answer is to I haven't explained that very well, and I apologise, but to jump short is that some things need to be separated from monetary value. So talking about tax and putting money into the NHS and other things or so on, you have to start looking at things you want to separate that are a necessary good and separate them from the kind of financial circular economy, because you'll always be chasing after more money. You'll need it from more wealthy people, other wealthy things. So you've got to start systemically looking for where you take essential services that make people's lives work out of that kind of circular financial taxation, money creation. Is that totally confusing?
Yeah.
Probably quite. We may or may not get a response. Last one again, then we'll
just quick and simple.
have a comment.
How do we get Richard a bigger audience?
Sorry?
How do we get Richard? Is it Richard a bigger audience? Because everything he said tonight, I totally agree with.
Thank you.
So we need to get
a bigger audience.
Richard and Judith to a bigger space. Well, this is part of a campaign or getting out and raising awareness. So let's take, so there's sort of a number of sort of linked things about how do we change in a world where some people argue we've become more selfish, or have we, or is that just the trend or what we're sold? Are we essentially more worse people than we were 100 years ago? And is that possible to change? And we might, this sort of taking it all into government and finance or something, but that's Judith, what do you...
I thought you touched on the environment, and I thought that was an interesting point, that actually if you look at where the world is heading, and the ice caps melting, etc., some of the issues that we've got in the world might make a lot of sort of things we're talking about now actually seem quite small problems. And I think there's quite a lot of scope for the tax system to look more at how it could address some of those environmental issues. I mean, I can't directly address them, but actually rethink the way that we tax with the view to the environment. I think that could be quite an interesting idea. Do I think that's going to happen? I think not. And sort of coming at one of the, I think my closing comment really would be, I think we've heard a lot of really interesting ideas tonight of policy changes from Richard, from the audience, and I think that it's really good to have that debate. I'm quite pessimistic that we're going to have anything like that in the UK in the coming years. And I think that actually, if you're looking at what the UK should be doing now, I think we're going to have to do an awful lot just to stay still and stay, and that's not a great position to be in. But the fact that we're coming out, multinational cooperation on tax is more and more and more important. We're coming out of the EU, which is just getting its act together on tax. We have been, like it or not, we have been one of the leading voices at the OECD. And we need to keep doing that, but the way that the UK is behaving in the world at the moment, I think, is absolutely disgraceful. And we are not going to be world leaders if we go around behaving like that. And I really fear for the future in terms of that, in the UK's position in international cooperation, unless this government, starts to change its views.
Richard, okay, and you can give a further plug to the Tax Justice Network, because that's the place to go to if you want to campaign.
There is a new Tax Justice UK, I would mention, that's being launched at the moment. I'm also an author of the Green New Deal. I have an enormous sympathy with, and as is Anne. We know each other well. So I have a lot of sympathy with what you say. Have we changed? I think there is a process of change going on. I am an optimist. I wake up every morning angry. I write a blog to get it out of my system. I have the next cup of coffee. I write another blog to get it out of my system. And by breakfast, I've normally written 4 blogs. That's how I start my day. Then I'm sort of calmer after that, perhaps. A bit. But I remain optimistic that there can be change. I look at what has happened over 15 years of campaigning on tax. When we came up with country-by-country reporting, it was nonsense. It was absurd. It was impossible. No accounting system could ever be changed to do it. The cost will be phenomenal. Look, it's happening now. For all the arguments, it's happening now. Automatic information exchange would never happen. It's happening There are other things that are going on which do happen now, which didn't. I'm not saying that that solves all the problems. I just believe that change is possible. And I do believe cultures have changed as well, and I do think they are fluid. And I think there's a lot of young people who are very angry about being faced with a situation which they don't accept as being right. And I happen to be the father of 2 teenagers who tell me very often that this is something that they're angry about. And they, I don't think, are particularly unusual in that sense at all. They don't like financialisation, although I'm told it is now the least cool thing possible at school to have cash. My son said yesterday, he said, I need some money. So I offered him a note. He said, no, I need you to top up my card because you can't be seen with money at school. You must pay for everything with the card, which is just so weird, isn't it? That's just so uncool to actually have money, cash. But that shows, in a sense, the way the world's going. One of my ideas for a tax to tackle, replace national insurance and to deal with excess consumption, that I call a cut. It's a carbon usage tax, but actually it's a financial transaction tax. And it would look at all the flows through your bank account. If your flows were quite small, you would pay a very small amount of tax. If your flows were quite large, you were a have-yacht, you will pay for the privilege by paying quite a large amount of financial transaction tax on literally using a bank account to process large amounts of money. This would not, of course, cover the things like payments into your mortgage, payments into your deposit account and out again and so on. It could be easily designed. Australia did it, it worked. Brazil did it, it was so effective that it paid for their equivalent to the NHS, which the right wing hated so much that they abolished the tax to make sure they couldn't have state-provided healthcare. So it is possible to do different bases of taxation, for example. But financialisation, look, you can tell people in the NHS that we won't pay them for doing their jobs, but they're really not going to be very happy with you, I'll be totally honest. My wife was a doctor for a long time. She wouldn't have been happy to have come home and be told, well, that was great, you did that for love, but you're now not going to be paid for it. She did used to have a thing that said if somebody turned up in A&E and it was wearing a badge saying, I hate tax, she said, yeah, you can go to the back of the queue then. Nobody ever did, thankfully. But the point is that obviously you have to financialise these things. People have got to be paid. They're as much a part of the economy as anybody else. There is no difference between the value of work done for a state sector employer from a private sector employer. We're all people. This is another one of those enormous artificial divides, which I'm really offended by. We are in a fluid situation. Do I do anything fundamentally different now I happen to work for a university from what I did before? Is a university a state employer or a private employer these days? God only knows. We're in these sort of ambiguous states. Let's live with that. Let's live with it. Money is a part of life. It's going to carry on. But what we have to talk about is how we use money to best effect. And remember, money is the flip side of tax. Government creates money. It injects it into the economy. We all need it to make the economy work. There isn't another mechanism we've got to actually make exchange happen well. We need price stability around it. Tax delivers that, but tax at the same time can be this mechanism for change. What we have to understand is that is what tax is about. We can have a better world. We can aim for full employment. We can have a government that interferes in the economy if we want to. It is possible, but we have to believe it. The economics we've had, neoclassical economics, is a faith system. Fundamentally, it says markets work. None of the conditions for market working exist, but nonetheless, we still believe it. Actually, what I've described, that money is spent first, which you said, oh, that's dangerous. No, that's what happens.
I know that's what happens.
It has happened. So we have to learn how to trust it and use it to best effect. That is what happens. It takes people a long time to learn. I'll give you one final little example, if I can. The Bank of England was created in 1694. In 2014, 320 years later, they finally agreed that when a bank lends money, it doesn't hand on savers' deposits. Actually, by lending, it creates the money that creates savers' deposits. So the right ordering event is not save and lend, it's lend and save. Well, I'm doing exactly the same with tax. After 1776, Adam Smith would have said, we tax and spend. No, we spend and we tax. Just as the Bank of England had to relearn its own lessons about what banking is, so we've got to relearn the lessons about what taxation is. Put those together and we have the foundation for a new economy. A brave new economy, I hope. But it will require some big politicians. Have we got them? Okay.
I thought you were going to end on a really positive note, but we're well past.
Yeah, I've got to go
we're well
home tonight,
past.
folks.
We need
I've got a long way to
we
go.
need a drink. We've been going for a long time, especially our wonderful speakers who have done a brilliant job. So I'd just like everyone to thank them very much.